Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adam Bittner, digital sports producer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and I am here on a Tuesday to speak with Matt Vensel, our Penguins beat reporter, after what was ended up being a hectic trade deadline. Matt, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm pretty good. When I did my last video for the week last Thursday, it was with Paul Zeiss. Nothing had happened at that point. Since then, there's been a lot of moves for the Penguins. They obviously traded for a handful of guys, also sent a handful of guys out of town. I'm going to start with the acquisitions, Matt. Of the three of them, who do you think has the potential to make the most impact for this team?
Well, it better be Mikael Granlund if they gave up a second-round pick and took on his contract. That was the most, I guess we'll say, scrutinized move. Obviously the cost comes down to it. The Penguins were looking at some other players. They wound up with him. He had a quiet first couple of games. He's a skilled player. He's on the smaller side. I think we're going to see him kind of toggle back and forth between center and the wing on the third line. Could see him play on the second line, but that's the guy they brought in to try to kind of infuse some skill and playmaking into the bottom six. I mean, he's probably a declining player at this point. He's 31. Didn't have a great season with Nashville, but he's the guy that really needs to deliver for them. And if he doesn't, that's not going to be good for Ron Hextall.
Who are you most suspect of these new additions? And is it possible that it's the same guy?
Oh, it's the same guy. Yeah. I mean, it's like, obviously he's a better player than Nick Bonino at this point in their careers, but they gave up two late round picks to get Bonino. So you have to factor in the cost to acquire him, but also the opportunity cost. I mean, I do know the Penguins, engaged with the Canucks about JT Miller. They were talking with Arizona about defenseman Jacob Chikrin. He ultimately ended up going to Ottawa. So it's not as if they weren't at least poking around and trying to acquire, maybe guys who are bigger names and would have more impact. But for them to settle on Granlund certainly was a surprise. And, you look at, trade grades or how people in the analytics community feel, just a lot of criticism all around for that acquisition. Just that, skepticism that he's not going to be much of an impact player at this point. And then he's still got 2 more years left on this deal of $5 million a year.
What does Nick Bonino have in the tank? Obviously, Penguins fans, remember him from the Stanley Cup years. He's since moved on. What percentage of that player that they remember is this guy at this point?
Maybe 80%. And I think that's fine in a fourth line role. I mean, they didn't bring him in to be a two-way third liner like he was during those cup runs. I think he's a suitable Teddy Bluger replacement. I mean, obviously Teddy had a disappointing season here. The Penguins were able to get a third-round pick back for them, which kind of offset some of the cost with some of these other trades. But with Bonino, he's a guy who can take faceoffs. He's a lefty, which is something I needed on the PK. Could see him play on the wing as well. That's something he did a little bit of in San Jose. So, again, he's not the same guy, but I don't think he needs to be that guy to be worth the investment for the Penguins.
What can you tell me about Kulikov?
Well, he's a veteran player. He's bounced around. He played for Anaheim, which is one of the worst defensive teams in recent memory this year. They relied on him to play in a top 4 role, which he probably was not suited for at this point in his career. The analytics on him aren't good, but 2 years ago, he was a very good, useful player for Minnesota, a playoff team. So, it's kind of a mixed bag there, but he's got a pretty good track record. He's a well-rounded defenseman, provides left-handed depth. We'll see who ultimately wins out in that battle between P.O. Joseph and him to play next to Jan Ruda on the third pair. But they were looking for depth. I mean, they, Ty Smith fractured his face, their prospect down in Wilkes. So he's out of the mix. They lost another defenseman in Ulay down there. So it was a depth move, but we could ultimately end up seeing him, maybe he's playing game 1 of the playoffs, assuming there is a game 1 in the playoffs.
I've seen some people a little bit upset that for what seems like the 3rd or 4th year in a row, P.O. Joseph seems to be playing for a job again. There's people who've kind of liked his game and have been glad to see him in the lineup. What do you think about him being, in jeopardy of potentially being left off, a playoff roster or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I like him. I think he's had a pretty good year. I mean, he's been a little bit up and down, and that's kind of been the knock on him. Even as much as his weight to his rise to the NHL and ultimately becoming a regular. It's just the inconsistency. I did think he settled down after not a great camp. So I think he's had a pretty good year. I mean, he's not the biggest guy. He struggles against more physical opponents, and that kind of leads to some of the consistency stuff. But he was playing really well a few weeks ago, especially that California trip. So I do wonder if this is kind of exploratory, where they're going to maybe play Kulikov some and PO some and let him kind of duke it out and kind of see who looks better next to Jan Ruda. But I think he's a promising player, and hopefully they haven't completely closed the door on him playing this year, because I think he can help them, and maybe even more so than some of the guys they already have.
I think his biggest story is the guys the Penguins brought in was some of the guys they sent away. Teddy Bluger, who I know you're a big fan of, Brock McGinn, Kasperi, Kapanen. To what extent do you think that there's potential there for those moves to end up being addition by subtraction, or are there any that you really disagreed with?
Well, you are right. I'm a big Teddy Bluger fan. Obviously, I think that's the one that could end up hurting him. I mean, I don't know if they had much of an appetite in re-signing him, and obviously they were able to get an asset back. But the other two guys, they just weren't really effective players, and I think it was a win for the Penguins to unload both of their contracts. I mean, that kind of went into the cost. I mean, McGinn was traded to Anaheim along with a third-round pick for Kulikov. I don't think Kulikov on his own is worth a third-round pick. That became such a high pick because they agreed to eat Brock McGinn's salary. So I do think the Penguins did well to move on from Kapanen and McGinn. We'll see about Bluger. But I think that's why, fans were so disappointed by how this all played out, because it kind of looked like when they were moving on from McGinn, they set him down in the minors, they traded Bluger. It looked like everything was lining up for a bigger move, whether it was Chychrun or JT Miller. And for them to bring in Mikael Granlund, I think just kind of was like, they did all that for that. So we'll see. I don't want to bury the guy yet. Skilled player, seems like a nice guy, has a pretty good track record as a pro, former top 10 pick. I just think fans were pretty underwhelmed, and I think they're right to feel that way after they made all those moves to create that space.
Yeah, I think that leads in well to my next question, which is this team any better? And to, what is the, if they are better, how much better? To me, it seems like it's a lot of basically a wash. It's kind of trying to sending struggling players out, bringing struggling players in, and see if you can get some different chemistry to work here. What is the best case scenario for this group?
Yeah, I mean, they feel like lateral moves or make the team a little bit better. I mean, it all kind of falls on Granlund there. Yeah, it's like you look at what all the other teams around the East did, loading up, and the Penguins, who were already struggling, inconsistent, not inspiring much confidence, made all these moves, and I just don't know how much better they are. I mean, I don't know if you can look at this team and then look at the rest of the East and say, okay, these guys are a real threat to come out of the East. And if they are going to do it, it's going to come down to their stars continuing to play great. I mean, I do think these moves, as questionable as they are in total, they were an endorsement for the way Sidney Crosby and Malkin and their wingers have played. Some of their defense, maybe that'll come together. So yeah, I mean, it comes down to the top six playing well. It comes down to Tristan Jarry. He's a big key here. And then, yeah, just kind of changing up the supporting cast, because this changes things. And I do wonder, too, if the Penguins will kind of tinker around with their line combinations and try to become up with a more balanced approach. I think they definitely need to do that. I know Granlund played for a long while with Zucker in Minnesota. They were very productive line mates together. You do wonder if that's something they could look at too here, is maybe playing those two together on the second line or the third line. Maybe Rust is in the third line, but I think they got to do something to kind of shake up the lines there to get more balance. But I mean, non-zero chance of winning the cup, sure, but I think the odds are pretty slim. And if that's the case, why did they give up 3 picks essentially to do this?
Yeah, and I also have questions kind of looking a little bit more long term, Matt, which is I think the criticism I would have, the biggest one of the Granlund move, is that you're holding on to him for, I believe, 2 more years. A lot of people have been frustrated with how Ron Hextall handled the salary cap this year, that kind of prevented him from maybe making some of those moves that other teams in the Eastern Conference made. Has he put himself in a position where if this move doesn't work and doesn't pay immediate dividends or even long-term dividends, that we could be having the same conversation next season where they're still kind of hamstrung?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the way I look at it is like the moves they made, they increased their cup odds this year a little bit, and they probably decreased their cup odds in future years. It really comes down to Granlund and whether he ends up being worth it in the long term. But I just don't know if like the short term benefit was enough for kind of the downside here with the opportunity cost of using $5 million on his cap hit. So yeah, I mean it's going to be a lot of scrutiny on Ron Hextall. There already is, but if this team misses the playoffs or goes one and done again in the playoffs, I mean, I think Fenway Sports Group is probably going to be taking a hard look at what they want to do with management going forward.
Yeah, I think that leads. I think you're really setting me up well here, Matt. What's it going to take for him to keep his job? A, and B, if you're skeptical of a general manager, why do you let him make a move like that you just described could make them worse in the coming years rather than better? Why do you let him make that move? Why don't you get rid of him earlier if the plan is possibly to get rid of him if they don't win a round in the playoffs?
What I don't know that Fenway Sports Group feels the same way that fans and certain media members around town are. I mean, I think they felt comfortable with bringing him back, and I feel like when they committed to bringing him back last offseason, he executed the plan. He got those 4 free agents to come back at a pretty reasonable salary. And I think like any smart ownership group would let things play out. I mean, I don't think it was something where this was such a disastrous season that they had to fire him mid-season. I mean, it takes something pretty harsh for that to happen. I do think like if Fenway Sports Group is like, why are we making this move? They would have stepped in and not let him do it. So, I think he can be on the hot seat without him needing to be fired mid-season, if that makes any sense. So, I don't know what it'll take for him to keep his job. If they miss the playoffs, obviously that'll be damning. If they lose in the first round, that wouldn't be great. I don't know what the cutoff is. It also was like, how do they play? I mean, if they have a hard-fought series against Boston and goes 7 games and they lose in the first round, that's not the same as them, getting swept 4-0 by the Islanders. So, I think they're wise to let it play off, especially because the perception of like being meddling and firing a GM halfway through the year, like the alternative is it might make it more difficult to hire his replacement if they feel like they need to step in and do something that seems chaotic mid-season.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. I think there were a lot of fans that had that question, so thank you for answering that one. Looking forward in terms of this year, the core has been pretty healthy this year. Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang. I think Chris Letang was out for a period of time, but otherwise, they've been pretty healthy. If the Penguins lose one of them, as history suggests they might for a couple of weeks here with about a month and a half left, and that sinks a playoff bid, how would that be looked at, and what are the chances that could happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I mean, I still think they're in comfortable enough position here where I think they would be able to get by okay if they were to lose one of those guys for a couple of weeks. They've kind of built back up a decent cushion with that 4-game winning streak that they had. Excuse me. But yeah, I mean, I think that's probably why there's some of the frustration about the moves that were and weren't made is like the Penguins actually got great health from their top players. And Sid is having, I don't know what his point pace is, but, for much of the season, he's been on pace for around 100 points, which like only 4 or 5 guys since the Penguins entered the league have put up 100 points at age 35 or older. And then you have Gino, who's playing really well. I mean, there's still the maddening plays, but if you look at just his production and things he's doing. So, yeah, I think that's probably why, Hextall decided to make these moves and go for it. And it's also why it'll be a big disappointment if the supporting cast isn't good enough to kind of capitalize in this year where everything lined up and their stars actually were healthy and, very productive for their relative age.
You mentioned that the Penguins do hold on to a wild card playoff spot as we're recording this video on Tuesday. But there are a lot of teams that are in this mix of that group. What are the teams that if you were the Penguins, you'd fear the most? Being able to get hot, get on a run, and maybe snatch one of those two wild card spots. Or if there's two teams, possibly snatching both and leaving the Penguins out.
Yeah, I mean, I was saying Florida when asked this question for 2-3 weeks now, but they just haven't been able to get in gear. And, in terms of like played a few more games, I just don't know if they have enough runway to catch the Penguins. Ottawa's surging. They got Chychrun. They've been playing really well of late. I mean, they're a young team that's kind of playing with house money at this point. Kind of same thing with Buffalo. But it seems like every time we do this exercise, like we check back in a week and 2 weeks ago, it was Detroit that was surging, and now they've lost like 5-6 in a row. So it seems like you look and it's like, oh, where did this team come from? But then you realize two others kind of fell behind. So if I had to pick at this point, just based on, the runway left, the two teams with the best chance is Ottawa and Buffalo. But I would be surprised at this point if the Penguins don't get in.
All right, Matt. Well, that's all I had for you. Do you have any final thoughts before we sign off the hockey talk for the week?
No, let's keep it coming. It's the best time of the year.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for stopping by, Matt. Everyone, please stay tuned for later in the week. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Christopher Carter on the North Shore Drive is going to be talking some football, talking some Pirates with Jason Mackey from Florida. We're going to get into some more college talk on Thursday with Pitt, Penn State, and West Virginia, all on the NCAA Tournament March Madness bubble. It's going to be a pretty crazy weekend of sports, Matt. I'm looking forward to it.
Sounds good.
Absolutely. And remember, if you like this video, please like it and help us out with the YouTube algorithm. And please check out the subscription deal down in the description. $6 for 6 months of access to postgazette.com. Everything I'm writing, everything's Matt's writing, everything all of our Post-Gazette sports writers are producing. You'll want to check that all out. Matt, thanks for stopping by, and we'll talk to you all again soon.
Anytime.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed it on Apple Podcasts, please rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down in the description.